Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the third of 3 videos in the Igneous Rocks video series. And again, I'm going to emphasize the importance of this diagram that describes the 3 textural classes of igneous rocks that we're going to consider in this class, including crystalline, glassy, and pyroclastic rocks. By the way, if you're taking the lab class, we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the textures of different igneous rocks in that class. But for our purposes in the lecture course, these 3 textural classes are sufficient. Okay, let's move on to some more concept check questions. First, I'll show you some examples of other kinds of igneous rocks. This is what obsidian looks like in both outcrop and hand specimens, typically a very dark rock. Remember that obsidian has a glassy texture, which means it's non-crystalline. You won't find many or sometimes even any minerals in obsidian because it didn't crystallize very well, or it may have crystallized, or it may have cooled too quickly for crystals to form. In any case, obsidian is a relatively hard, dark rock that can be modeled different colors. And then something else kind of interesting and usually diagnostic about obsidian is that it has these sort of divot-shaped fractures in it when you break a piece off. That's called a conchoidal fracture, and that's typically the way that glass breaks. Window glass will also exhibit conchoidal fracture in some cases, for example. Here's what an obsidian flow looks like from the air as the lava sort of pushes up, and then once it gets to the Earth's surface, it kind of slowly oozes its way in all directions to kind of form this sort of landform that almost looks like the top of a mushroom. It just sort of spreads out in all directions. Here's what pumice looks like. Pumice, like obsidian, is also a glassy igneous rock. So it too is, for the most part, non-crystalline. The main difference, though, between pumice and obsidian is that pumice is more airspace than rock space. Pumice will literally float in water. And when you see it in hand specimen, it contains lots and lots of small frozen gas escape holes called vesicles. So think of pumice as highly vesicular obsidian. And very often, as you might expect, pumice and obsidian are found together, sometimes in the same outcrop. Okay, on to pyroclastic igneous rocks. Remember, these are composed of fragments that have been blown explosively out of the throat of a volcano. And here we're starting with tuff, which is a fine-grained pyroclastic igneous rock. This particular tuff that we're looking at here is known as the Bishop tuff, and it erupted around 760,000 years ago, very near Mammoth in the eastern Sierra. And nowadays, if you go to the Mammoth area, you'll see this sort of unremarkable valley. It's a few miles long by just a couple of miles wide. It's known as Long Valley. It's a fairly gentle valley on the landscape. But 760,000 years ago, Long Valley was the site of an absolutely cataclysmic eruption of highly felsic, highly gas-charged magma that erupted in a very explosive, violent way. In the Mammoth area, the Bishop tuff is on the order of 1,500 or even 2,000 feet thick or more. And you can see that it was a truly widespread eruption in that it scattered ash from the one eruption eastward all the way into the Midwestern states and westward out into the Pacific Ocean. There are even places in the Anza-Borrego Desert east of San Diego where it's possible to find layers of tuff from this eruption. So in contrast to tuff, volcanic breccia is, of course, much more coarse-grained. We're generally dealing with pyroclasts, fragments that are maybe walnut-sized or larger, perhaps even up to boulder-sized, like we're seeing in this exposure. Okay, another concept check question. Name this rock. It's medium-colored, has a medium silica content, and is coarse-grained, meaning visible crystals. Okay, So medium colored and medium silica content, right away, that's going to tell you that the rock is intermediate in composition. So just from that, then we've narrowed down the field to either diorite or andesite. And this is diorite, and we know it's diorite because of the fact that it's coarse grained, because it has visible crystals here, those that we can see with the naked eye. Clearly, this rock formed intrusively. So again, this rock is intermediate, this crystalline rock is intermediate composition, intrusive in origin, has to be diorite. How about this one? Name this rock. It's highly vesicular volcanic glass and it floats in water. Of course, that's pumice. Just a quick outcrop that's frankly kind of interesting. This is out in the Anza-Borrego Desert. There's my rock camera for scale. And what we're looking at here is a sheet-like intrusion of magma called a dike. And in this case, the dike intrusion intruded parallel to the layering built into the surrounding country rock. The country rock is much older than the dike rock. And in this case, can you appreciate that overall the rock is pretty light colored? So that tells us that this rock is felsic in composition. It has a low color index, meaning a low percentage of dark colored silicate minerals. And from that information, then we know at a glance that this rock is felsic in composition. And then even from a few feet away, where I'm taking this picture, we can still make out crystals in the rock, some of which are actually a few centimeters long, these sort of needle-like crystals in the rock. That's a type of mineral that San Diego County is famous for. It's called tourmaline. And in this case, we have large black tourmaline crystals in this granitic dike. And then if we zoom in, what was kind of fascinating to me about this outcrop is that along the side of the dike, where the magma is in direct contact with the colder, older country rock, we see a chilled dike margin. And that just means that where the magma contacted the cooler country rock, it cooled still slowly enough to form visible crystals, but rapidly enough to ensure that the crystals were small. And then if we move inward away from the dike margin into the interior of the dike, kind of the middle of the dike, we see a marked increase in crystal size. That's a single crystal, that's a single crystal, that's a single crystal. And what's happening here is the middle of the dike became somewhat insulated from the outer margins of the dike. And so the interior of the dike cooled much more slowly than the margins of the dike, and that slower cooling in the inside of the dike resulted in larger crystals. So here's a typical question that I might ask on an exam. I might show you a picture like this of a hand specimen or perhaps an outcrop, and then in this case I mentioned that the rock is composed entirely of crystals, of visible crystals. Can you name the rock? Let's break it down. So my overall sense in looking at this photograph is that yes, it contains a mix of light and dark crystals, but to me, it's the light crystals that really dominate this rock. This is a pretty light colored rock overall with a fairly low color index. So that's going to tell me that the rock is felsic in composition from its light color overall. And the fact that I can see the crystals, all of them, implies that this is an intrusive rock versus an extrusive igneous rock. So again, felsic in composition, intrusive in origin, has to be granite. And then finally, let's go back to the fundamental theory of the Earth, which we talked about first day of class, what's known as plate tectonic theory. Where do igneous rocks form, or can we understand the formation of igneous rocks in light of plate tectonic theory? And indeed we can. The two main plate tectonic environments where igneous rocks form include subduction zones, where one plate dives beneath the other, and that leads to the generation of magma, which can then rise up to the surface to create the volcanic arc. And then the other main plate environment where we get magma and lava and igneous rocks would be divergent boundaries. As two plates move away from one another, the underlying rock is depressurized. It undergoes decompression melting, and the magma then seeps up to the surface and spills out typically onto the seafloor, because most divergent boundaries occur out at sea versus on the continents. There's another environment where some igneous rocks form, and it's known as a mantle plume. I encourage you to watch this short YouTube video that summarizes important details of mantle plumes. But think of a mantle plume as not so much related to plate tectonics. Think of a mantle plume as a rising column of hot rock shaped like a vertical cylinder, like my pen here. And because the rock is warmer in the plume than the surrounding rock, that's why the plume rises. And it tends to rise vertically. And overall, it has this kind of cylindrical shape. And when this hot rock gets close to the Earth's surface, it undergoes decompression melting. It melts to produce magma. And then if that magma can find a conduit up to the Earth's surface, it will leak out onto the Earth's surface to form a volcano. However, because the mantle plume is thought to be relatively stationary in comparison with the plate above, once the volcano forms atop the plume, it becomes part of the migrating plate. And invariably then, the volcano itself migrates off of the hot spot, off of the mantle plume, and a newer, younger volcano is created in its place. And then that newer, younger volcano is pushed off of the plume as a result of plate motion, or rather it's carried off of the plume because the volcano is part of the plate, and an even younger volcano forms, and so on and so forth. And so with time, just like we see in the Hawaiian Islands, you see this age progressive chain of volcanoes. And the youngest volcano, the active one, typically is centered directly atop the mantle plume, and then the further away you go from the plume, and this is true in the case of the Hawaiian Islands, the older the islands become. But keep in mind that, at least according to plume theory, all of the Hawaiian Islands ultimately originated atop the Hawaiian plume, where the big island of Hawaii is now situated. And then finally, it's also the case that whenever the Earth's crust is extended sufficiently, that too will generate decompression melting, and magma and lava can be the result. So in this last diagram, in this case, we don't have a full-fledged divergent plate boundary, so we don't want to call this a divergent plate boundary yet. It's simply a zone of crustal extension where the Earth's crust and perhaps the lithosphere, the entire lithosphere in this case, has been extended sufficiently that that magma can begin to form. Often, but not always, you can think of these areas of crustal extension as incipient divergent plate boundaries. These are sites in continental areas where plate boundary divergence is just getting going. Okay, well, at the very end here of this third of three videos, I put in a summary. I think if you watch these three videos and study the information presented, you should be able to answer these questions in the summary, so you should be okay. Okay, thanks everyone. Let me know if you have questions.